In a decision that sent shockwaves through Washington and global markets, the U.S. Supreme Court has delivered a verdict that will be studied for years to come. The court has struck down the Trump administration's sweeping tariffs, a move that immediately reverberated across the corridors of power and trading floors worldwide. This landmark ruling dismantles a key pillar of the America First economic policy, fundamentally altering the way presidential authority can be exercised over international trade agreements and disputes. The tariffs, which targeted China and several U.S. allies, had sparked years of global friction, igniting trade wars and raising costs for American businesses and consumers alike. Many industries struggled to adapt, while everyday Americans felt the pinch at the checkout line. Now, with the court's decision, a contentious era comes to an abrupt end. Businesses, both large and small, are being forced to rapidly adjust to a dramatically changed trade landscape, rethinking supply chains and pricing strategies almost overnight. Markets reacted instantly. Agricultural futures surged as farmers anticipated new export opportunities, and manufacturing stocks rose on hopes of cheaper imported materials and components. However, not everyone welcomed the news. Domestic steel producers, who had benefited from tariff protections, braced for renewed competition from abroad, raising concerns about potential job losses and plant closures. The ruling is more than just a policy reversal. It's a powerful statement on the separation of powers, reinforcing the limits of unilateral executive action in matters of trade and reaffirming the role of Congress in shaping economic policy. Around the world, governments and investors are watching closely as the United States navigates the economic and diplomatic fallout of this historic change, with many wondering how global alliances and rivalries will shift in response. To truly understand the full impact of this moment, we must look back at how these tariffs came to define an era of global trade conflict, shaping relationships and economies across continents. The Trump tariffs began in 2018, when the administration invoked Cold War-era laws to impose steep duties on steel and aluminum imports, citing national security concerns. This move was unprecedented in recent decades, signaling a dramatic shift in U.S. trade policy. Soon after, the administration set its sights on China, using Section 301 of the Trade Act to levy tariffs on more than $350 billion worth of Chinese goods. These tariffs covered a wide range of products, from everyday electronics and furniture to industrial machinery and auto parts, affecting both businesses and consumers across the country. The stated aim was clear: to pressure China into changing its trade practices, address issues like intellectual property theft, and ultimately protect U.S. industries from what the administration saw as unfair competition. However, the immediate result was higher costs for American manufacturers and consumers alike. Companies faced unpredictable price hikes on raw materials and finished goods, forcing many to raise prices or absorb losses, which rippled through the economy. Retaliation from China and other nations was swift and targeted. U.S. agricultural exports, especially soybeans and pork, were hit hard, devastating farmers' access to key international markets and leaving crops unsold. The tariffs marked a sharp break from decades of U.S. policy that favored globalization and multilateral trade agreements, such as NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, signaling a new era of economic nationalism. Businesses across the country struggled with mounting uncertainty, unable to plan for shifting tariffs, changing supply chains, and unpredictable trade rules. Many delayed investments or scaled back operations, unsure of what the future would hold. This climate of volatility and confusion set the stage for a series of legal battles as companies and trade groups challenged the president's authority to unilaterally reshape global commerce. Ultimately, the battle over tariffs and executive power would reach the nation's highest court, where the future of American trade policy would hang in the balance. American businesses, importers, and industry groups challenged the tariffs in court, arguing the executive branch had overstepped its constitutional authority. Lawsuits focused on whether Congress had delegated too much power to the president under trade laws from 1962 and 1974. Plaintiffs claimed these statutes lacked clear limits, giving the president a blank check to impose tariffs. The government countered that national security and foreign policy have always warranted broad executive discretion. Conflicting lower court rulings made Supreme Court review inevitable. The case, American Institute for International Steel versus United States, became the definitive test of presidential trade authority. Billions in commerce and the future of U.S. trade policy hung in the balance. In a landmark 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the broad use of tariffs under Section 232 was an unconstitutional overreach of executive power. This decision marks a significant moment in the ongoing debate over the separation of powers within the U.S. government. Chief Justice Roberts emphasized that Congress alone has the constitutional authority to impose taxes and duties. He argued that the law's vague national security justification gave the president too much leeway, potentially undermining the checks and balances system. The majority opinion revived the non-delegation doctrine, a principle that had been dormant for decades, signaling stricter limits on what Congress can delegate to the White House. This decision could reshape the legislative landscape, requiring more precise language in future laws. Dissenters warned that the ruling could weaken the president's ability to respond swiftly to global threats, arguing that flexibility is crucial in times of international crisis. They cautioned that this decision might hinder the executive branch's ability to act decisively. The decision immediately invalidated steel and aluminum tariffs, which had been a point of contention in international trade. It set a precedent likely to challenge other trade measures, potentially affecting the global economic landscape. The court ordered an end to Section 232 tariffs, but left the door open for Congress to pass new, more specific trade laws. This invites lawmakers to craft legislation that clearly defines the scope of executive power in trade matters. The message was clear: sweeping economic policy must originate from the legislative branch, not the Oval Office. This decision reinforces the importance of Congress in shaping the nation's economic future. The balance of power in U.S. trade policy had shifted, emphasizing the need for collaboration between branches of government. This decision could lead to a new era of legislative involvement in trade policy, ensuring that all voices are heard in the process. The tariff's economic impact was swift and far-reaching. Studies showed nearly all costs were passed to U.S. importers, raising prices for businesses and consumers by over $50 billion annually. While steel and aluminum jobs saw modest gains, job losses in manufacturing sectors that rely on those materials far outpaced them. U.S. exports to China plummeted and imports dropped, permanently altering global supply chains. Companies scrambled to shift production to countries like Vietnam and Mexico, incurring major costs. The greatest toll was uncertainty. Businesses delayed investments and hiring, unsure of future trade rules. The Federal Reserve linked this uncertainty to a slowdown in business investment and economic growth. The data is clear: the tariffs aimed to protect U.S. industry, but imposed heavy costs at home and abroad. The trade war's legacy is one of disruption, not revival. The Supreme Court's decision split American industries. Manufacturers and business groups cheered the end of high raw material costs and unpredictable trade rules. Automakers and equipment makers expect lower costs and renewed competitiveness. Steel and aluminum producers, however, warned of a flood of cheap imports and called for new protections from Congress. Farmers, battered by retaliatory tariffs, welcomed the ruling but remained cautious, urging swift diplomatic action to restore lost markets. Across the business world, relief at the end of uncertainty is tempered by the challenge of adapting to a new trade order. The ruling is seen as a return to stability, but also a call for Congress to craft a smarter, more targeted trade policy. The post-tariff era brings both hope and new risks. America's trading partners responded with cautious optimism. The European Union hailed the ruling as a win for rules-based trade and signaled readiness to resolve disputes and lift retaliatory tariffs. Canada and Mexico welcomed the decision, eager to restore smooth North American supply chains and roll back their own countermeasures. China's response was measured, acknowledging the ruling but withholding immediate concessions, waiting to see U.S. actions. Other nations, from Japan to Brazil, see the decision as a possible pivot away from confrontation and toward renewed U.S. engagement in multilateral trade. Yet skepticism lingers. The economic tensions that fueled the tariffs remain unresolved. Global leaders are watching how Congress and the White House will shape the next phase of U.S. trade policy. The world hopes for stability but prepares for more uncertainty. The next moves in Washington will set the tone for global commerce. The Supreme Court's decision resets U.S. trade policy, launching a period of transition for global markets. The Biden administration faces the complex task of unwinding tariffs and negotiating the removal of retaliatory measures with allies and China. Businesses must again rethink supply chains, deciding whether to return to China, diversify, or adopt a China Plus One strategy. The pre-2018 globalized model is unlikely to fully return. Congress now holds the reins, setting up a fierce debate between protectionists and free traders over the future of American trade. The likely outcome: more targeted strategic trade measures, not sweeping tariffs. The ruling could revive the World Trade Organization's role, but reform is needed to address modern economic challenges. The end of the tariff era opens a new chapter, one of negotiation, adaptation, and global realignment. The world economy is entering uncharted territory. The Supreme Court's decision marks a turning point in U.S. trade policy and the balance of power in Washington. By reasserting Congress's authority, the court has ended an era of unilateral tariffs and forced a national debate on how America should compete globally. Markets, businesses, and allies are recalibrating, while steelmakers and others brace for new challenges. The Biden administration and Congress must now craft a sustainable, targeted trade strategy for the 21st century. The ruling closes a contentious chapter, but the underlying economic and geopolitical tensions remain. The framework for trade policy has changed, but the substance is still to be written. Will this moment spark a return to international cooperation, or is it just a pause before new protectionist battles? The answer will shape the global economy for years to come.